My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
Tonight I have some good news for you. We will have a Democrat in the White House on January 20th, 1977.
Ladies and gentlemen of the convention, proudly I place before you the name of Jimmy Carter as the nominee of the Democratic Party and the next president of the United States.
Election 1976, the Democratic National Convention. Your host is political analyst Richard Scammon.
This is Richard Scammon in Washington. With me here are Professor Howard Penniman of Georgetown University and Mr. Stephen Hess of the Brookings Institution. Today, we want to discuss the Democratic Convention. We'll do the Republican Convention at a later time when that meeting has been finished. But perhaps before we do either of the detailed discussions on these conventions, we ought to spend at least a few minutes talking about the basic purpose of an American national presidential nominating convention. One observer has said that these conventions are real ideological struggles clothed as circuses. And we all know that their main purpose is to nominate a candidate for president. But Howard Penniman, beyond that, how can we briefly describe the process of an American convention?
Well, a national convention, as you suggest, is the time for the nominating of a candidate for president and for vice president. It is also the one time that the party has a national existence. It meets there with delegates from every state in the Union, elected by various means, this time usually by the direct primary, but sometimes by convention. And it meets as a national party, the one time that it really operates in that fashion. It nominates its candidates, and it writes a platform upon which the candidates stand with such variations as the candidates themselves choose to put in it. It does a number of other things. It serves as a meeting place of the leaders of the party, and when there is a good deal of unity, as there was at this last convention of the Democratic Party, by contrast to a couple of its predecessors, it does the job of unifying the party. It serves as a kind of rallying, monster rally for the benefit of the faithful around the country.
Yes, and it gives us all, since we all watch it on television, the Democratic Convention, it starts on a Monday night and it runs through to Thursday night, so there are 4 days in which all television is turned to it. So it gives us, as American electorate, the voters, a chance to look in on this party, or at least a large collection of its leaders, and get a sense of what they're all about. By the speakers they put before us, so they're symbolic. Do they put a black woman? Do they put an Italian? Do they put somebody from the South before us? What are the issues that seem to excite them? In 1968, 1972, there were many issues that had excited them. This time, it was very interesting how few of these issues, what happened to them. And so we come out of it because of this intense exposure with some sense of who these people are. We see interviews with the candidates and with their mothers and with their children and with their party leaders, and it helps us make a decision.
You know, I think for our friends overseas, we also ought to point out that while the party does adopt a platform dealing with domestic and foreign policy in these conventions, one must treat this platform with a great deal of caution. It is basically designed to get you elected, not necessarily to be a house for the next 4 years. And that in most instances, all of us, Americans and our friends overseas, would be better advised to listen to the candidate, who is the one who interprets the platform and who makes it real if he becomes president. And one can never forget the basic task. And the basic task of the party is to select someone who, under their label, will run for president in November, and if successful, will form a new administration.
I think as a footnote to what Steve was saying, there's also the question of these exciting issues that he was talking about. When we have exciting issues in a party, we also have a divided party. The issues were not so exciting this time because the Democratic Party was not divided in a fashion which it has been in.
You know,
in
it's
some of the recent
interesting.
years.
It's very interesting what you say, Howard, because it is true. It is true that amongst Democrats whom I know, they would much rather have the quiet convention of 76 than the controversial issue-oriented convention of 68 and 72. 68 and 72 were much more interesting. They were dramatic. There were fights, there were disputes, there were roll calls, there were debates. Perhaps, I'd say yes, definitely. More people watched in 68 and 72 than this time. The All-Star baseball game, as a matter of fact, was held right during this convention, and a lot of people watched that. But let's watch some of the scenes from this past Democratic National Convention.
It was 144 years ago that members of the Democratic Party first met in convention to select a presidential candidate. And our meeting this week is a continuation of that tradition. But there is something different about tonight. There is something special about tonight. What is different? What is special? I, Barbara Jordan, am a keynote speaker. When a lot of years passed since 1832, and during that time it would have been most unusual for any national political party to ask a Barbara Jordan to deliver a keynote address. But tonight, here I am. And I feel that notwithstanding the past, that my presence here is one additional bit of evidence that the American dream need not forever be deferred.
We are in the tradition of America, a tradition of pioneering, of adventure, of optimism, of confidence and faith, a tradition of caring and sharing. That is the character of America, and that is the story of the Democratic Party. This party of ours has always believed that no challenge is too great for the American nation. Therefore, we must muster our strength, our courage, our imagination, and our great energy. We can become whatever we want to be.
Ladies and gentlemen of the convention, proudly I place before you the name of Jimmy Carter as the nominee of the Democratic Party and the next President of the United States.
Madam Secretary, Illinois is happy to cast 164 votes for the next president, Jimmy Carter, 2 votes for Brown, 1 for McCormick, 1 for Udall, and 1 for Wallace.
Kansas, the 34th state, is pleased to cast 34 votes, 32 for Carter, 2 for Udall.
The Kansas vote is 32 votes for Governor Carter and 2 for Congressman Udall. Maine.
Madam Secretary, state of Maine casts 15 votes for Governor Carter, 5 votes for Congressman Udall.
North Dakota, the geographic center of the North American continent, the Peace Garden state, casts all of its 13 votes for Governor Jimmy Carter.
The North Dakota vote, 13 votes for Jimmy Carter.
As chairperson of the Ohio delegation of this nation's largest delegation pledged to Governor Jimmy Carter, I am proud and honored to join with Congressman Lou Stokes and his 21st District delegation to cast in the spirit of unity and love and victory in November 132 votes.
I have 2 announcements to make. One is that I've decided to accept the nomination for president. And the other one is that I've asked to serve as my running mate, if the delegates will approve, Senator Walter Mondale from Minnesota.
Happy and honored to nominate my dear and good friend, Senator Walter Mondale, to be the Democratic candidate and the next Vice President of the United States.
Delegates and friends, I am proud to accept your nomination as your candidate for Vice President of the United States. And I pledge to you tonight, and I pledge to all Americans, that I will do everything in my power to elect Jimmy Carter the next President of the United States.
Ours is a party of the man who was nominated by those distant conventions and who inspired and restored this nation in its darkest hours, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Ours is a party of a fighting Democrat who showed us that a common man could be an uncommon leader, Harry S. Truman. Ours is a party of a brave young president who called the young at heart, regardless of age, to seek a new frontier of national greatness, John F. Kennedy. And ours is also the party of a great-hearted Texan who took office in a tragic hour and who went on to do more than any other president in this century to advance the cause of human rights, Lyndon Johnson. Now, our party was built out of the sweatshops of the old Lower East Side, the dark mills of New Hampshire, the blazing hearths of Illinois, the coal mines of Pennsylvania, the hard scrabble farms of the southern coastal plains, and the unlimited frontiers of America. Ours is a party that welcomed generations of immigrants. The Jews, the Irish, the Italians, the Poles, and all the others, enlisted them in its ranks and fought the political battles that helped bring them into the American mainstream, and they have shaped the character of our party. That is our heritage. Our party has not been perfect. We've made mistakes and we've paid for them. But ours is a tradition of leadership and compassion and progress. I see an America on the move again, united, a diverse and vital and tolerant nation, entering our third century with pride and confidence, an America that lives up to the majesty of our Constitution and the simple decency of our people. This is the America we want. This is the America that we will have. Thank you very much.
Those were excerpts from the proceedings of the Democratic National Convention in this month of July, the convention which nominated Jimmy Carter and Fritz Mondale for president and vice president. What we want to do here now is to analyze what happened in that convention, try and tell you something about what this means for the election, what it means for the years of a new administration if this comes to power. Howard Penniman, what does Jimmy Carter really stand for in this election?
Well, Jimmy Carter stands for a number of things, I think.
I mean, other than the decency and the rest that was described in his speech.
Well, he no doubt stands for that, too. But he stands, I think, for unity within the Democratic Party. He is somewhere in the center of that party, a little bit maybe to the left of center. He stands for the things that can unify a once badly divided party. He stands for, I think, racial improvement in racial conditions, greater equality for minority groups, at a time when the North and the South are now much closer together than they have been in the last 30 years on precisely this issue, which began dividing him way back in 1948. He stands for, on the economic side, I think, a good deal of relatively limited reform, but reform which is going to increase somewhat the expenditures of the national government in the welfare field, in aid to the cities, in national health programs, and in expenditure of funds for the aid to the unemployed, and perhaps to decrease the number of unemployed. These kinds of things which are slightly to the left of center, I think, in the Democratic Party, but not to the left of the delegations that were at the convention, though.
And he certainly stands for managing. government. This is fairly unique among recent presidents. Jimmy Carter, after all, if he becomes president, will be the first former governor, a state chief executive, to be president since Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932. Our presidents have tended to come out of the legislature. Jimmy Carter seems to be very interested in how government runs, the organization of it. He has made a very big issue of government reorganization. It is clear that he is a very serious planner. The fact that a candidate who was virtually unknown the beginning of the year has been running for nearly 2 years and has had, we now know, a game plan, an actual scenario of or outline of how he would get from being an unknown to capture the Democratic nomination, and followed that game plan. So that if there should be a Carter presidency, I think it would be a very much more managerial presidency than we've known in the recent past.
I think it would surely be oriented that direction. Managing the American government is a massive task, and changing it greatly may be something that we will not see so much of. I think changing much on administration is very, very difficult in any massive organization, and surely the United States government is a massive organization.
You know, the thing that has impressed me most about this Democratic convention and about the primaries which preceded it was that this was such a strong swing away from the perceived left-wing convention of '72, which nominated Mr. McGovern, a swing back towards the center. Maybe a little left of center because the whole party is left of center, but the center of the Democratic Party. In a sense, I suppose this was the defeat of what you might call the retreating right and the diminished left, that the real core of the party, as represented by Carter, is a party of the liberal center, left of center, whatever you wish to call it, but it is a very strong move away from the McGovern type of campaign, just as the Republicans in '68 moved far away from the Goldwater campaign of '64. Now, part of this may be a matter of principle, and part of it may be simply a matter of expediency, in the sense that when you get too far off the center in American politics, you lose your shirt, as Mr. Goldwater and Mr. McGovern can testify. But it looks likely, assuming Mr. Ford is renominated by the Republicans, that this election of '76 may really be slightly left of center versus slightly right of center. Two basic moderates in the mainstream of American thought. Now,
certainly we saw in the Democratic convention a party that wanted to win. Now, we expect that the will to win is what holds politicians together. It's been absent in the recent past in the Democratic Party, who've been out of office for 8 years. And now they have come together and nominated a Southerner, which is very unique in itself. The South was a major component of the coalition that elected Franklin Roosevelt and that kept the Democrats in office for 20 years. But in recent years, because it's a more conservative section of the country, it has been drifting into the Republican camp. Bringing in as the presidential nominee a Southerner is a major step toward putting together the pieces of the coalition that kept the Democrats in office through the 30s and the 40s.
It seems to me one of the reasons this could happen is because the two issues which divided Democrats first and divided Republicans were the issues of civil rights and the issue of the Vietnam War.
Right.
Both of these are gone. The Vietnam War, because it's completed, however satisfactorily or unsatisfactorily. But the civil rights one is at least minimized because of tremendous progress in the United States and change both in the South and in the North in the degree of racial equality that has come about over the last 15 years or thereabouts. And that problem, well, goodness knows not solved, is not at such an exacerbated level that a party gets fully divided, as the Democratic Party once was, over this issue in the days of 1968.
Let me ask both of you, Howard and Steve, do you agree? We've been talking about moderation in politics, movement towards the center and so on. Would you both agree that in foreign policy, which I know is a major concern of many of our friends overseas, that in foreign policy, despite the rhetoric of many a speaker on the podium in this last convention, despite the rhetoric, that basically a Carter administration, as far as one can judge it, would maintain a foreign policy not significantly different, not markedly right or left from the present Ford foreign policy. Would you agree with this as a general premise?
Yeah, I think all of our clues to this point would point in that direction. For example, in Jimmy Carter's acceptance speech, there was very little emphasis on foreign policy. He, as I said before, was a state governor. He has not been experienced on the scene, so that we have very little to go on in terms of his personal record. In terms of the advisors he seems to be turning to, they're not very different in kind than the advisors that John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson had when they were presidents. The party platform is certainly a continuation, in my judgment, of the direction of foreign policy that we have had for the last 8 years. So I think all the clues point, at least, in the direction.
The speeches, of course, gave much less emphasis to foreign policy than to domestic policy.
As they always do in America.
Anytime if you're not in a crisis in the United States in foreign policy, you're not going to emphasize that because your votes come from people who are interested primarily in domestic policy. The platform gives an enormous amount of space to foreign policy, but as Steve has been saying, it is with some changes in rhetoric and some emphasis here or there that's somewhat different. But clearly, the expectation must be that it will continue basically the policy which has been guiding the United States, I would say, since the Truman period.
And if we look upon domestic policy as being the real base for American politics, which I agree entirely it is, then we are faced, I suppose, really with this problem. Two problems. Can Jimmy Carter maintain this reconciliation of many very divergent elements within the Democratic Party? I mean, the gaps in the Democratic Party are still there. Can he maintain this reconciliation and this unity until November? And if he wins, how long after November before those gaps open up again? Howard?
I would suppose he can probably maintain it, or the better part of it, through November. I would suppose that it gets more difficult when you actually begin writing legislation come next January and February. Again, I would suppose, though, that if there is a large Democratic majority, suppose now for the moment he is elected, and there's a big Democratic majority in the Congress, he should be able to get the support of that Congress on virtually any issue that he presses, given the fact that he won't press anything out at an extreme position. He should maintain that unity, I would think, well into the summer or fall, maybe through the first full year of his presidency. And there will be then some of those economic reforms that I talked about earlier.
Now, would you agree in this case, Steve, that if these economic changes, which many Republicans say will result in heavy inflation, do result in that kind of inflation, would you feel that that year, that honeymoon year, might be shortened up a bit for Jimmy Carter if he were elected president?
Well, it will be a very strange future for Jimmy Carter, I think, in terms of having a president and a Congress of the same party, which we haven't had, and so we can presuppose a certain harmony, which I tend to think is a charade because of the very diversity of both the Democratic Party and the interests of Congress. So, of course, he gets a honeymoon. You always give a new man a little breathing room and a break. But I think, should there be a Jimmy Carter presidency and a continuation of a Democratic Congress, we may see over time, 2 or 3 years, a very interesting development in which a Democratic president is at loggerheads with a Democratic Congress.
Well, here Stephen Hess and Howard Penniman have been discussing with me in Washington the Democratic National Convention, what happened and why. Later, after the Republican Convention, we'll be discussing the work of that convention as well. This is Richard Scammon from Washington.
am honored by your nomination, and I accept it.